July 1944. Normandy, France. A month has passed since the world held its breath, and Allied soldiers stormed these beaches in a cataclysm of fire and steel. D-Day was a victory, but a fragile one. The foothold is secure, but the breakout, the great sweeping advance that is supposed to liberate France, has stalled. It has choked to death in a place the soldiers have come to call the Green Hell. This isn't a battlefield of open fields and clear lines of sight. This is the Bocage, an ancient, man-made labyrinth of small, sunken lanes and tiny pastures, walled in not by fences, but by hedgerows. And these are not the gentle hedges of an English garden. They are monstrous things. 10-foot high, 15-foot thick ramparts of earth, stone, and tangled. Ancient roots, crowned with dense, thorny trees. For 1,000 years, they have divided this land. Now, they are dividing life from death. Inside the turret of an M4 Sherman tank, the world has shrunk to the size of a steel coffin. The air is thick with the stench of oil, sweat, and fear. You can hear the distant crump of artillery, the chatter of a machine gun. But the real enemy is silence. He's out there, just beyond the next wall of green, waiting. Your orders are to advance, to push through. But you know what happens next. The tank lurches forward, its engine roaring, its tracks churning mud. It reaches the hedgerow, and the nose of the 30-ton machine begins to climb, tilting backward at a terrifying angle. For a few eternal seconds, the tank is a helpless, exposed beast. Its thin belly armor, its most vulnerable point, is lifted to the sky, a perfect target, and in that moment, a ghost in a field gray uniform rises from a hidden spider hole, lifts a simple, stovepipe-like weapon to his shoulder, and fires. You don't see the rocket, but you see the result. A flash of blinding light, a sound like the crack of doom, a jet of molten metal, moving at over 5,000 miles per second, punches through the floor of your tank, turning the inside into an inferno. This is the grim, repeating nightmare of the Normandy stalemate. American armor, the steel fist that was supposed to punch through the German lines, is being systematically dismembered, one tank at a time. Morale is plummeting. The casualty lists grow longer with each passing bloody day. The greatest invasion in history is on the verge of grinding to a halt, strangled by dirt, roots, and the ingenuity of a desperate enemy. A solution is needed. And it won't come from a general's map table. It will come from the mud, from the mind of a man who has stared into the green hell and refused to blink. To comprehend the sheer, soul-crushing despair of the Normandy campaign in early July 1944, you have to understand the Bocage. It wasn't just terrain. It was a weapon, an ancient, organic fortress that the Germans, masters of defensive warfare, had turned into the most effective tank killer the world had ever seen. Imagine a grid of sunken lanes and tiny fields, each no bigger than a football field. Many much smaller. Each one is surrounded by a hedgerow. These weren't planted bushes. They were earthen dikes, built up over centuries by farmers clearing stones from their fields. They were dense, solid, and packed with the tangled roots of trees that were hundreds of years old. Trying to drive a tank over one was a fool's errand. The Sherman, tall and with a high center of gravity, would rear up, exposing its vulnerable underbelly and often sliding off or tipping over. The Germans had engineered this landscape into a perfect, multi-layered defense in depth. Every hedgerow corner was a potential ambush point. They would dig in a single anti-tank gun, a high-velocity Pak-40, or a machine gun nest, sometimes even a tank, and cut firing lanes through the foliage. An American armored column advancing down one of the narrow, sunken roads was canalized, unable to maneuver, forced into a kill zone. The lead tank would be knocked out, blocking the road. The tank behind it would be trapped. Then, from the flanks, from hidden positions the Americans couldn't see, the Panzerfausts and Panzerschrecks would open up. The Panzerfaust, the tank fist, was the German infantryman's great equalizer. It was a simple, disposable, recoilless weapon that fired a shaped charge warhead. It didn't rely on kinetic energy to punch through steel. Instead, upon impact, the explosive charge would collapse a copper cone inside the warhead into a narrow, hypervelocity jet of molten metal. This jet could pierce even the thickest armor, spraying a deadly cone of fire and shrapnel inside the tank, killing the crew and often igniting fuel and ammunition. For the American tankers, the psychological toll was immense. They were fighting blind. They called it Ambush Alley. Every rustle in the leaves, every shadow in the corner of a field could be death. They would button up inside their tanks, peering through narrow vision slits, the claustrophobia almost unbearable. The infantrymen, who were supposed to be supporting them, were just as vulnerable, pinned down by machine gun fire, unable to scout ahead effectively. The synergy between tank and infantry, the core of combined arms warfare, had completely broken down. The American High Command was desperately trying to find a solution. Engineers were brought in with massive amounts of explosives to try and blow gaps in the hedgerows. This was a slow, dangerous process that alerted every German for miles around. It also left a massive crater that the tanks then struggled to cross. They tried equipping tanks with bulldozer blades, tank dozers. These could eventually clear a path, but they were few in number, and the process was agonizingly slow. While a single tank dozer spent 30 minutes clearing one hedgerow, the rest of its platoon was a sitting duck. The advance was measured in yards per day. The cost was measured in a torrent of blood and burned-out steel. The stalemate was absolute. The Germans believed they had found the formula to bleed the American army dry in Normandy, and for a few grim weeks in July, it looked like they were right. The architect of the American ground war in Normandy was General Omar Bradley, a calm, studious, and deeply respected commander. Bradley was facing the greatest crisis of his career. The D-Day landings, for all their heroism, had only been the first step. The plan had always been to secure a lodgment and then launch a massive, decisive breakout, an operation that would shatter the German defensive lines and open the way to Paris and beyond. That operation had a name: Cobra. Operation Cobra was Bradley's masterpiece of planning. It was a bold, ambitious plan designed to use overwhelming air power to blast a hole in the German front, followed by a massive armored thrust to exploit the breach. The concept was simple. Thousands of heavy and medium bombers would lay down a carpet of bombs in a narrow, rectangular sector of the front west of the town of Saint-Lô. This aerial bombardment, unprecedented in its concentration, was intended to obliterate the German defenders, pulverizing their positions and stunning the survivors. Immediately following the bombing, infantry divisions would move in to secure the flanks of the corridor, and then the armored divisions would pour through the gap, not fighting forward, but turning west into Brittany and then east, encircling the entire German 7th Army. It was a brilliant plan on paper, but it had one glaring, potentially fatal flaw. It all depended on the tanks being able to move, and move fast. The entire logic of Cobra was speed and exploitation. But how could the tanks break out when they were being systematically destroyed in the hedgerow country? Bradley knew that if his armored columns got bogged down in the Bocage, immediately south of the carpet-bombed area, the Germans would have time to recover, rush in reinforcements, and seal the breach. The entire operation would fail. The stalemate would continue, and the political pressure from both Washington and London to show progress would become unbearable. The conventional solutions were failing. The explosives were too slow. The tank dozers were too few. A sense of deep frustration, bordering on desperation, began to permeate the Allied high command. They had achieved the impossible by landing in Normandy. But now, they were in danger of being defeated by thousand-year-old mounds of dirt. The generals looked at their maps, the logisticians looked at their supply charts. But the answer wasn't on a map or a chart. It was out there, in the field, with the men who were living and dying in the green hell. They were the ones who truly understood the geometry of the trap, and one of them was about to find the key. In the ranks of the 2nd Armored Division's 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, there was a young sergeant from New York named Curtis G. Culin III. Culin was not a West Point engineer. He was not a high-ranking strategist. He was a tanker. He had felt the lurch of his Sherman as it tried to climb a hedgerow. He had heard the terrifying whoosh of a Panzerfaust. He knew the problem intimately in his bones. And like every other soldier in Normandy, he was desperately searching for a way to survive. The story goes that the moment of inspiration came during a simple conversation. Culin was talking with a fellow soldier, a Tennessean named Roberts, who was lamenting their situation. Roberts supposedly said, "What we need is some kind of hedge-buster, something that can plow through these things like a rhino." The image stuck. A rhino, a powerful beast with a horn, designed for ramming and tearing. Cullen's mind began to work. He had seen the beaches on D-Day. He remembered the massive German anti-invasion obstacles, huge, angular structures of welded steel beams designed to rip the bottoms out of Allied landing craft. The Allies called them Czech hedgehogs. After the landings, thousands of these things were now just scrap metal, rusting on the beaches. Scrap metal with a purpose. The idea that sparked in Cullen's mind was audacious in its simplicity. What if they took that German scrap metal and turned it against them? What if they took the steel beams from the hedgehogs, welded them together into a set of massive, sharpened tusks, and mounted them on the front of a Sherman tank? Instead of trying to climb over the hedgerow, a tank equipped with these prongs could charge it head-on. The steel teeth would bite into the earthen wall first, lifting the roots and tearing them apart, while the 30-ton weight of the tank provided the brute force to punch through. The tank wouldn't expose its belly, it would burst through the hedgerow at ground level, emerging on the other side with its main gun and machine guns already level, ready to fire. It was a crazy idea. It was battlefield expediency at its most raw. There were no blueprints, no official requisitions. Culin and the men in his unit, working with wrenches and a welding torch, became battlefield inventors. They found a wrecked German hedgehog, cut off the beams, and, through trial and error, fashioned the first Culin Rhino device. It was ugly, it was crude, but as it sat, welded to the front of their Sherman, it looked menacing, it looked purposeful, it looked like it just might work. News of Sergeant Culin's crazy contraption traveled fast through the rumor mill of the 2nd Armored Division. The initial reaction was what you might expect: skepticism, amusement, even ridicule. The Army was an institution of official channels and approved modifications. A bunch of enlisted men, welding scrap metal to the front of a $500,000 piece of government equipment, was not exactly standard operating procedure, but in the desperate environment of the Normandy stalemate, even the craziest ideas were worth a look. On July 14th, 1944, a demonstration was arranged. A small group of officers, including General Bradley's liaison, gathered by a particularly formidable-looking hedgerow. The test tank, with Culin's crew inside, sat idling 100 yards away, its new steel tusks glinting in the summer sun. The order was given. The Sherman's engine roared to life. The tank lurched forward, picking up speed, churning across the small field. It didn't slow down as it approached the hedgerow. It accelerated. The officers watched, holding their breath. This was the moment of truth. Would the tank rear up and stall? Would the welded prongs just snap off? The tank hit the hedgerow with a thunderous crash. Dirt and rock flew into the air. For a heart-stopping second, the massive machine seemed to hesitate, its engines screaming under the strain. And then, with a great, tearing, grinding groan, it broke through. The steel tusks had dug in, lifting and ripping a huge section of the earthen wall apart. The Sherman didn't climb over. It plowed through, bursting out the other side in a shower of dirt and vegetation, its turret traversing, its guns ready. It had created its own door. The effect on the assembled officers was electric. They weren't just impressed, they were stunned. This wasn't a slow, methodical breach like a tank dozer's. This was a violent, tactical assault. A tank could now cross a hedgerow in seconds, maintaining its momentum and fighting capability. The officers immediately understood the revolutionary implications of what they had just witnessed. This crude, sergeant-built device was the key. It was the weapon that could break the Bocage. The news was rushed up the chain of command, all the way to General Bradley himself. Bradley, a man desperate for a solution, didn't hesitate. He immediately ordered a full demonstration for his personal review. When he saw a platoon of Rhino tanks tear through a series of hedgerows with unstoppable force, he knew he had his answer. The stalemate was about to be broken. General Bradley's reaction was immediate and decisive. He ordered ordnance and engineering units to drop everything, literally everything, and begin mass-producing the Culin device. He famously declared, "If we need to, we will work around the clock, 24 hours a day. I want these things, and I want them now." What followed was one of the most remarkable logistical feats of the campaign. An army of welders was born. Ordnance depots, maintenance units, and engineering battalions across the Normandy beachhead were turned into makeshift factories. The raw material was plentiful. The beaches were still littered with thousands of tons of German steel obstacles. Trucks began hauling the scrap metal to the workshops, where teams of men worked day and night, cutting the beams and welding them onto the fronts of M4 Shermans and M10 tank destroyers. There were no official blueprints. The design was refined through trial and error, passed from one workshop to another by word of mouth and rough sketches. Some units developed their own variations, but the basic principle remained the same: a set of sharp, powerful steel teeth that would allow a tank to rip its way through the green hell. For the tankers who were receiving these modifications, the effect on morale was transformative. For weeks, they had felt like helpless victims, lambs being led to the slaughter in their steel coffins. The Rhino modification, or Culin cutter, as it was officially known, turned them back into predators. It gave them agency. It gave them a weapon that could defeat the terrain itself. As the ugly, powerful attachments were welded onto their tanks, a surge of confidence and grim determination swept through the armored divisions. They were no longer afraid of the hedgerows. They were about to make the Germans afraid of them. In just over a week, from the first demonstration to the eve of Operation Cobra, an astonishing 60% of the tanks in the American First Army had been fitted with the device. It was a triumph of battlefield innovation and logistical improvisation. The clock was ticking down to July 25th, the planned launch date for Cobra. Bradley's great gamble was about to begin, and its success now rested on the strength of a sergeant's crazy idea and the welds holding pieces of German scrap metal to the front of American tanks. The morning of July 25th, 1944, dawned hazy over Normandy. At 9:30, the air began to vibrate with a low, deep rumble that grew into a deafening, earth-shattering roar. Operation Cobra had begun. Over 1,500 B-17 and B-24 heavy bombers, followed by hundreds of medium bombers and fighter bombers, appeared in the sky. For the next 3 hours, they unleashed a terrifying, concentrated torrent of high explosives on the 6-square-mile patch of the German front line. The earth shook. The German defenses, including the elite Panzerlehr Division, were systematically vaporized. Survivors were left deafened, bleeding, and shell-shocked, stumbling through a moonscape of craters and pulverized earth. The aerial carpet had been laid. Then came the ground assault. Infantry divisions moved forward to secure the shoulders of the breach. And then the order was given for the armored divisions to advance. This was the moment of truth. From their assembly areas, hundreds of M4 Shermans and M10 tank destroyers revved their engines and began to move forward. And on the front of the vast majority of them were the crude, powerful steel tusks of Sergeant Culin's invention. The German commanders who had survived the bombing, their lines shattered but their will to fight intact, fell back to the next line of defense. They prepared their anti-tank guns and their Panzerfaust teams, expecting the American advance to slow to its usual bloody crawl as it hit the Bocage. They were in for a horrifying surprise. The American tanks didn't stop. They didn't slow down to wait for engineers. Didn't cautiously probe for weak spots. They didn't hesitate. They charged. When the lead Shermans reached the first hedgerow, they didn't try to climb it. They hit it at full speed. With a crash of steel and a great tearing of earth, they ripped through, bursting into the fields beyond, their machine guns chattering, their main guns firing. Behind them, more tanks poured through the gaps they had created. For the German defenders, it was a psychological nightmare. Their greatest defensive asset, the terrain itself, had been rendered useless. Tanks were appearing where they were not supposed to be, moving at speeds they were not supposed to be able to achieve. The interlocking kill zones collapsed. The carefully planned ambushes were overrun before they could be sprung. The stalemate wasn't just broken. It was shattered into a million pieces. The American armored columns, spearheaded by the Rhino tanks, poured through the breach, fanning out, sowing chaos and destruction, and beginning the great encirclement that would trap and destroy the German 7th Army. The Green Hell had been conquered, while the strategic impact of the Rhino device was immediate and decisive. The human story behind it continued to unfold. Operation Cobra was a stunning success, but it was not without cost. In the chaotic, swirling battles that followed the breakout, many of the tankers who owed their lives to the new invention would still fall. The war was far from over, and the German army, even in retreat, remained a deadly and determined foe. But the Culin cutter had fundamentally changed the odds. Tank crews who, just a week earlier, had a grimly short life expectancy, now had a fighting chance. They could move, they could attack, they could survive. The invention saved thousands of American lives, not just in the armored divisions, but among the infantry who no longer had to make suicidal frontal assaults against an unseen enemy. And what of the inventor? Sergeant Curtis Culin was not the kind of man to seek the spotlight. He had seen a problem, and he had fixed it, not for glory, but to keep himself and his buddies alive. But the army, for all its bureaucracy, knew how to recognize a war-winning idea when it saw one. Culin was awarded the Legion of Merit, a prestigious medal rarely given to an enlisted man. He was recognized as the man whose simple, ingenious idea had saved the Normandy campaign. The story of the Culin cutter became a legend within the U.S. Army, a prime example of American ingenuity and the power of bottom-up innovation. It was a powerful reminder that sometimes the most brilliant solutions don't come from the top of the command chain, but from the bottom, from the NCOs and enlisted men who are face to face with the enemy, who understand the brutal realities of the battlefield in a way no general ever could. It was a testament to the culture of an army that, at its best, could empower a sergeant with a welding torch to change the course of a war. The breaking of the Normandy stalemate on July 25th, 1944, was a pivotal moment in the Second World War. The success of Operation Cobra, made possible by the Rhino tanks, had a ripple effect that was felt across the entire Western Front. With the German lines in Normandy shattered, General George S. Patton's newly activated Third Army was unleashed. Patton's tanks, many of them equipped with Rhino devices, roared through the breach created by Cobra and executed one of the most audacious advances in military history. They raced across France, bypassing pockets of resistance, encircling and destroying entire German divisions. The liberation of Paris, which had seemed a distant dream just weeks earlier, now became an inevitability, occurring on August 25th, less than a month after the breakout. The German army in France was decisively defeated, suffering a catastrophe on the scale of Stalingrad. The Allies were on the doorstep of Germany itself far sooner than anyone had dared to hope. None of this would have been possible without the breakout from Normandy. And the breakout would not have been possible, at least not without catastrophic casualties and delays, without a solution to the riddle of the Bocage. The Culin cutter was the key that unlocked the door. It's a stunning thought. The entire grand strategy of the Allied campaign in Western Europe, the plans of Eisenhower, Montgomery, and Bradley, the fate of nations, all hinged, for a moment, on whether a tank could get through a mound of dirt. And the solution was provided not by a team of scientists in a lab, but by a sergeant with a keen eye and a steady welding hand. The legacy of the Rhino tank is a powerful lesson in the nature of warfare. Technology and strategy are vital, but they can be defeated by something as simple as terrain. And sometimes, the only thing that can overcome such an obstacle is the ingenuity of a single soldier. In the final accounting of war, history rightly remembers the great generals, the epic battles, and the grand strategies. But victory is often forged in smaller, quieter moments, in the flashes of brilliance that occur far from the flag-draped map rooms. The story of Sergeant Culin and his Rhino device is one of those moments. It stands as a testament to a profound and enduring truth about warfare. The most effective innovations are often born of necessity, on the front lines, by the people who are living the problem. They are not handed down from on high. They are built up from the mud and the scrap. The German defenders in the Bocage had created a near-perfect defensive system. They had used the terrain to neutralize the Allies' overwhelming superiority in tanks and firepower. They had turned the hedgerows into a fortress that was bleeding the American army white. They were defeated not by a more powerful tank or a bigger bomb, but by an idea that was simple, practical, and perfectly suited to the problem at hand. The legacy of the Culin cutter is not just in the burned-out hulks of German tanks. left in the wake of Operation Cobra. It is in the lives of the thousands of Allied soldiers who came home because of it. It is a powerful lesson that resonates in military doctrine to this day, that the soldier on the ground is often the greatest expert, and that empowering individual initiative and ingenuity can be a weapon more powerful than any piece of ordnance. The image that endures is not of a general poring over a map, but of a lone Sherman tank, its front adorned with a crude set of steel tusks, pausing for a moment before a seemingly impassable wall of green, and then, with a roar of its engine and a shower of earth, it charges forward, not over, but through, tearing a hole in the fabric of the war itself. It is a symbol of how one man's refusal to accept the impossible can change the world.